This was a special time in my life. JFK had just come out in 91 in December, and there was a tremendous storm of controversy that occupied me in early 72 and mid-72. In fact, it still occupies me. It's just into the 2000 period. This is a story that won't go away. Very much I was looking forward to getting perhaps away from the country, away from the fire pan, and getting a little perspective on America. So I welcomed the opportunity to develop the project. I had bought a book from Robert Klein in association with Lee Hayslip, a Vietnamese emigre, but called When Heaven and Earth Changed Places. It was a highly complicated story with a lot of traditional archaeological digging into immigrant life. But what fascinated me was the theme of a character, especially a woman, a young woman, straddling two worlds, the East and the West, and the resulting balance of her values, which was crucial because I had done two war films. One was a total war film, Platoon, and Born on the 4th of July was also, like this film, Heaven and Earth, an attempt to span a more ambitious period of time, 30 years in a man's life or so, when he goes from an idyllic boyhood described in Massapequa, Long Island, to war, then comes back to the same neighborhood but doesn't recognize it anymore. Well, the same thing is going on here. We have an idyllic childhood, much like Massapequa, and she will return later in the movie to this home and find it completely different, like you can never go home again. But what she learns in her journey is different than Ron Kovic. It's a whole different ballgame. The original, the title reel, was designed differently in the script as a story, culminating with the 54 destruction of the village by the French. But it ended up, because of time, being part of a montage to title. See, what's beautiful about it is 54, the French destroy the village. And this is about right now when they rebuild the village in 57. And they have 3 to 4 years of decent prosperity now, before the Viet Cong come, and now the new war. The message in this movie, Heaven and Earth, is perhaps, for me, corny as it may be, one of the most profound that I think I can ever give. It's truly felt, not just by me, but it was felt by the author of the book, Lee Hayslip. She is this person. She embodies this ethos, this philosophy of Buddhism, matched with compassion and all the highest virtues of Buddhism. Let me just say that I had the project, and I wanted to make it as a third in a series of films about Vietnam. It was billed, perhaps wrongly in the marketing, as a trilogy, because it wasn't a trilogy. A trilogy is 3 stories that are the same. However, these stories vary. Each one is different. So, but whatever the bastardization of the word requires that it's a trilogy, be that as it may. And I think perhaps people thought it was a war story, whereas it was really the story of a woman. A story of a woman growing up in innocence in Vietnam, and her innocence is shattered by the combination, the forces of war and savagery, by the French in 1954, and again by the Viet Cong, and then by the Americans, and by the South Vietnamese soldiers. And then she goes through periods of great hell and torture, and she reemerges, like Ron Kovic in a sense, in America, though, stronger, far stronger than when she ever started. So we see the growth here from a young woman of nothing, 7 years old, to 40-something years old with 2 children of her own. One of the most ambitious undertakings I had ever done up to that point, coming off of JFK. For me, it was the perfect antidote. Quiet film, out of the country, in Thailand, which I loved. It was a chance to just sort of get out of the country and in a sense, recoup and lick my wounds a bit from the ordeal of JFK. Bob Richardson, I felt very strongly from the beginning that we had to shoot this film, parts of it in Vietnam, but we tried and could not get permission from the government because of its neutral leanings. It was neither pro-Viet Cong, anti-Viet Cong, pro-American, or anti-American. In fact, Lee Hayslip told me once in passing that many of the more tough areas of the book that she had written about the American GIs and some of the things they did in the villages was cut out at the request of the publisher, so that it would enhance or at least ensure the sales of the book in America. Same problem is true in Vietnam, too. She couldn't put in some of the more ferocious savagery that was visited on her by the Viet Cong and by the North Vietnamese. So the book was equally reviled in some circles in Vietnam as well as in here in America. But Lei Lee lived a very bizarre life, and you know, in a movie of this length, you cannot go into all the details. She was involved with several different American men. She was also, briefly, for economic reasons for her daughter, a prostitute in Vietnam, as you will see. So some people will say that she was, you know, a user and a gold digger and all that. But the truth is, I met with a woman, I've lived a long time with her. She's devoted her life to charity, and she runs the East Meets West Foundation to this day with all her heart and passion. If some say too much passion, and some of her American co-workers, rebel against her intensity. But what was lacking in the book was an ending. I was trying to write the screenplay, and I became more and more aware of this. I combined any number of American men, let's say for the benefit, 5 men, 6 men. I combined them into one male character sufficiently strong to attract a good actor who would help the financing of the film, because it was not a cheap film. As you can see from the period that we cover, the shots are big. This entire village of Kyla, K-Y-L-A, that you see, although it looks like it's part of the landscape, was really rebuilt from scratch by Victor Kempster and his production design crew. There are some 34 hardwood buildings, there's roads, there's moats, there's pens, there's animals, there's enormous rice fields that we constructed. Believe it or not, the rice fields had to look green. I wanted the green, brown, yellows of Vietnam to emanate the tobaccos, the rich green, which opened my eyes in Vietnam. The 6 inches, I called it, in front of my face, is green. In order to do that, we were devastated the first time through by a monsoon, actually, that destroyed most of the village and most of the rice. So we had to postpone the shooting to later in the fall of '92. The town was rebuilt, and finally Victor Kempster gave up on the Thailand rice, and he brought in American rice, super rice. So that what you see in the film right now is beautiful super rice, which is coming from America. This is bizarre, considering that Vietnam is the rice bowl of one of the rice bowls of Asia, or used to be. That's a beautiful green, though, especially here in this scene when she runs past the temple and sees the Viet Cong for the first time. It's a beautiful shot, too. The symmetry of it. I situated that pagoda, and Victor built me a little pagoda there, just in the middle of nowhere. That's where it belonged. There was a karmic reason for it, a triangulation with a village. And of course, I think that's a great shot when she slides down with her brother, and then she sees the enemy for the first time walking in. She knows her childhood has changed forever. That's her older brother, Ba, who reemerges later in the film. It's one of the most incredible speeches at the end of the picture. All his bitterness and all his anger come up to the surface, whereas her younger, more handsome brother, Dusty Nguyen, who became famous on American television, is disappeared in the North as a soldier. When Mama Joan Chen sends 2 soldiers north to fight for the cause, because she believes that it's a war of independence and America is the oppressor, and that she's sending her children to the north. The father, on the other hand, played by Hang Nor from Killing Fields, does not want anything to do with that and would rather have the kids avoid war at all costs. So it's the mother who sends the children to their potential deaths. And what follows in this simple tearing apart of this family, which seems like nothing at the beginning, is perhaps a 20 to 30-year departure. For they will never see the young one again, and the older man comes back a bitter soldier many years later. There was another beginning on the movie involving an old Vietnamese fairy tale, which I hope to include in the DVD, wherein we illustrate this old story told by Lei Lee in her book of the witch and meeting the witch in the rice paddies. It's a spooky story. It has to do with the cycles of growth and regrowth and destruction that occurred in these Vietnamese villages. Every year, imagine a cycle of rain, a cycle of sun. There is a cycle of growing, a cycle of letting the rice grow, picking it and harvesting it and making it and refining it and pounding it and putting it in bags and shipping it to the ports and wherever they can sell them. Rice is the way of life. In fact, twice a year, some of them can plant the rice and do these 2 cycles a year. So I studied with Lei Li the research of the agricultural rice gathering, and I really wanted to make a Eisensteinian agricultural film in the first reel here, which was really substantially longer. I cut it way down for American commercial reasons, and much criticized for much of that. A lot of the Vietnamese stuff is cut short because, as I was told, we didn't want to have a Vietnamese star, but and it would be difficult for an American audience to respond. But still, I believed in it, and I captured the concept of a cycle in the beginning. And the first reel, to my mind, is one of the most beautiful reels I've ever done, because the titles just are weaved into this incredible Kitaro theme. Kitaro was a Japanese composer with Buddhist tendencies who I hired. Never done a feature film. Had many difficulties. We sent him back to work 10, 15 times. We punished the poor man in a sense, but he really learned to write for the film. He really learned to write, and he worked as hard as any man ever worked, and he turned out, I think, one of the great themes of all time. I don't say that jokingly, because I hear it constantly in elevators, and I hear it played all over the world in hotels. And it seems to have caught a small but popular mentality and a following. Kitaro never wrote another theme, as far as I know, for a large film, and continues to write his own music, but he's a very spiritual-minded man, and lived at that time not far from me in Colorado. It's also circular. The music, as is the film, is constructed in a circular fashion. It may, to some, seem repetitive in that it doesn't go anywhere in the literal narrative sense of the word. So much more the power of it, to my mind, is the repetitiveness, the circularity, the plus ça change, le plus ça reste le même aspect of the land. The land must always refertilize itself every year. And the people take their culture from the land. The land is ruined one day with the arrival of the French in 1954. In actuality, some 10 pages of script were devoted to the French invasion, which was the first one, and really traumatized young Lei Li's life, because they burned down her house and her father had to rebuild it. And he was a very rich man at that time in the village, and he never quite regained that prosperity. When you see the ball of fire go across the sky, it's one of the most enduring images of that film to me, because you'll see it later again in the film. When it comes at a point of severity, it's between heaven and earth, between father and mother, live the people. The people grow. This is the cycle as made by man and as made by God. This is the creation, and it's a simple cycle. And it is upset, of course, by war. War totally destroys the cycle and makes refugees of these people, rips apart the village, and you will see what happens. It makes prostitutes of girls, makes greedy monsters of many men, makes neighbor turn against neighbor, etc., etc. It's a civil war. There's nothing worse, in my opinion. This film had no nominations for anything. It was totally overlooked at the time of release, unfortunately, by a press that was in love with Schindler's List. A great film, but there was no room for any other film to exist at that time. And a small Vietnamese film made by a young director called Scent of Green Papaya had just come out, but it was really wholly different intention. Small film made in Paris by a Paris exile. But that film, because it was made by a Oriental, I think hurt us, in the sense that the attitude here in America is that ridiculous and shallow perception that a white man cannot make a picture about a Oriental, A, and B, certainly not about an Oriental woman, which I think is absolute nonsense. I mean, you can make a picture about anything if you study it long enough, because you study it. You research it. I spent as much time with Lei Li as I could in the north of Vietnam, in the south of Vietnam, and incidentally, before we shot 1 foot of film, I insisted, this was a real struggle, but I insisted on sending Bob Richardson up north. I couldn't go because I was too known, but I insisted on sending Bob, my DP, up north under the guise of a documentary film company to shoot some of the enormously beautiful, huge landscapes that you have seen in the first reel of the titles. That is actually North Vietnam, and some even South Vietnam, but it's just stunning. So most of that is done in Vietnam, most of the big landscapes. The community is made up, for the most part, of real Vietnamese exiles living in camps or just out of camps in northern Thailand. We brought them down and put them into peasant garb. And, frankly, a lot of these people hadn't been peasants. Thank God, quite a large chunk of them were. And Lei Li led the charge insofar as she was the first one into the paddy fields with the leeches and the snakes and all that, and pulling up her pant legs and leading the, you have no idea the complexity of reconstructing the agricultural methods of the 1950s. Very few people, we found out, remembered how, you see. So thank God Lei Li had a good memory and was able to lead us. But it's as important in its own way as Dale Dye doing the military radio signals in platoon. You don't remember this stuff. Some of the people had to be taught. Lei Li was always there, so much of the singing that you see in the fields is, although it was ridiculed at the time by American people who knew nothing about it, missed the point that they do sing in the fields, or did. And singing in the Orient is considered the highest form of worship. It's one of the most beautiful forms of worship. It's a sign of joy, of happiness, which is the essence of Buddhism. So joy and happiness are very much a part of this. And, it was considered too idyllic by Americans, but I don't know that sometimes Americans were too sophisticated for this film. They misunderstood that this film was conceived in the pulse of a peasant, of an agricultural experience by a young woman in a village, not in a city. That this village was the typical story of the Vietnamese. So that when the New York Times came to pan the film, they sent in to do it a female Vietnamese woman who had never spent any significant time in any village. She came from a very well-educated bourgeois city Vietnamese. Could not relate to these people. These are the lowest of the low. These are the outcasts. This is what makes the film, in my mind, authentic. It may not be perfect. I'm sure we got a lot of details wrong because it's hell to ask Vietnamese people to speak in the English language. That's not their first language, but that is a license you take in a film like this. Unless you want to make it a documentary and have subtitles, but you're going to even risk losing that. The film may, in the end result, have been a financial failure, but nobody got too badly hurt. And most importantly, people forget one thing. Look at the facts. At the end of the day, the film, although it did poorly in the United States, was still domestic gross of some $6 to $7 million, and a foreign gross of maybe a similar amount. That's $12, $13, $14 million. That's not much by the standards of big films, but it's far bigger than most art films will ever do in their lifetime. So a lot of people saw the film. That's good. A lot of people also reacted to the film, and it is one of the most forgotten films I've ever done. It is also one of the most beautiful films I've ever done, and Bob Richardson, I thought, deserved some attention for his beauty of his photography, and Victor Kempster for the authenticity of his design. All this is recreated. Not one thing is real. The NVA come at night, or the VC, they are furious with the Americans. They're furious with a teacher who's an American collaborator, and they kill him in front of Lei Li. It's her first shock. Early on in the film, one of the things that was unfortunately cut in the 1954 French sequence was a very traumatic experience that had happened to Lei Li. It was a ghost story. There's a lot of ghost stories in Vietnam. It's like actually like Indonesia, right? A lot of belief in superstitions and ghosts, and feng shui. It's the concept of how you lay out your house, and the wizard tells them what to do to get the kids back, and you see a lot of that superstition coming in and out. The magician opening his hands and the bird flying out. They would go out around the countryside, the puppet shows, and very important. And the dances were beautiful. There was a whole tradition that was destroyed by militarization and putting people in hamlets, you see. It destroyed the land. Robert McNamara, who I since met, and is a lovely man, but he didn't understand that at the time. The ghost story was really traumatic. It was in black and white, and came to the village. They were Moroccan troops, and they actually hacked to death a husband and his wife because I think they were trying to rape the wife, and the husband loved her. But it was so sad, and it really traumatized her, but I cut it out of the film. One thing I did leave in the film in black and white was a dream scene where she saw, which she admitted to, she had a dream where her brother, the young handsome brother, who she loved the most, was thrown out of a helicopter by Americans. Now, whether this happened or not, I have no idea, but it was certainly done by Americans. We have plenty of proof of it. Colby himself told me, the head of the CIA, that a very effective program to terminate the infrastructure of the Viet Cong and NVA inside South Vietnam. And one of the things they did was to throw them away into the landscape. Not only is it a terrifying scene, as you can see, but you must realize that for a Vietnamese to be buried, to not be found by your family is horrible. I mean, the whole point at the end of the film is finding the bodies, getting them back. So when you throw a body out over the countryside, you don't know where it lands, or you're never going to see it again. It's a horrible desecration of the spirit. It alienates you from your ancestors and ultimately from your God. The wizard controlled the way you thought. Astrology controlled so much of your life. Here he's trying to figure out what happened to the young son, actually the two sons. And he says to them, one is okay, the other one is far away, I'm not sure. This guy is played by a Chinese actor, Michael Chan, who I love. He was in that wonderful Taiwanese or Hong Kong film called The Cage People. He played one of the older guys in the cage. He's a great old actor, hundreds of films. Joan Chen, I'd always been a big fan of. I first met her when she arrived here in the United States as a young immigrant before Bertolucci made great use of her in Last Emperor. And Joan had really started from scratch over here. And she was really the best I could find who could speak English, and she did a great job as the mother. She sacrificed her vanity under the wrinkles and black teeth, the betel you notice in her mouth. That's betel nut, B-E-T-E-L, which the peasants, many of them like to chew. It's sort of a mild form of stimulant. Unfortunately, it ruins their teeth over time, but Joan dug right in. In fact, I sent Joan Chen alongside Hip T. Lee and Lei Lee up to Vietnam before we started shooting in order to spend a week working in the fields. I'm that kind of a director. When I see two actors with a bucket of water between them, I want the thing to look like they're actually doing it. When I want to see Joan Chen carrying a baby, I want it to be like the baby they carried. I want sacks on the backs of these women. I mean, those of you who've been out there know that women can carry 6, 7 sacks on their head. They're so incredibly balanced. And, so I wanted Joan and Hip to get a sense of that, which they did by hanging out in the village where Lei Lee Haislip had grown up. You have discrepancies. Joan Chen is Chinese, and Hang Nor is Cambodian. Now, why would I not cast a Vietnamese? Well, this is a good question. I went looking for that girl. I went looking for Hip T. Lee to play Lei Lee all over the United States. We had a tremendous search party in places like San Jose, California, Los Angeles, Dallas, Texas, Houston, and we went to the East Coast, to Washington area, Arlington, Virginia, places like that. Canada, Toronto. We had a tremendous national search for a newcomer. And I think I was in a position to do that at that time because of the enormous international success of JFK. So we had lines around the block in these places. I mean, we really put a lot of people on tape, but we could not find very many older Vietnamese people at that time, in '92, who could speak excellent English or even acceptable English. It's a real problem. They had not been trained in English. The younger people, yes, more so. Hip T. Lee emerged from the University of Davis in the California system, an agricultural school up in Northern California. She showed up with a friend one day, had no interest in acting, but just went along with the friend, and apparently I put her on camera, and I think from the first I saw her, I said, this is the one, she's the one, she's got the grit. And the irony, of course, was that she came from the same region as Hip T. Lee in Da Nang, and that she herself had been a boat person. She had escaped with her family, who had gone through a lot of troubles during the war, and escaped to Hong Kong, had a miserable experience on the boat. I can't even begin to assume some of the things I heard happen. But it was so close to Lei Lee. Lei Lee took an instant liking to her, and they moved in together, way ahead of schedule, into the village that Victor Kempster had built in a place outside of Phuket, Thailand, on a small island with a lot of jagged hills in the distance. They lived in the town. Lei Lee made that house her own. She designed it herself. She brought the wizard. I mean, all these people are really the way life was. When the VC take her brother, Dusty Nguyen, to the north, she never sees him again, and she knows it. But she inherits the mantle of her brother and wants to be a soldier. But she's not a soldier. She was a forgiver. And this is one of the few films I've seen, American films, and what I'm most proud of is at the end of the movie, with all the shit she's gone through, from both sides, that she's able to forgive her enemies. There can be nothing finer in a civilized mind. Nothing. Lei Lee is a great source of inspiration for me and made me into a Buddhist, a bad Buddhist maybe. She doesn't understand the Ningpa, the crazy Buddhists. She likes those more. But she's a wonderful woman, and I see her from time to time. The NVA, because she has joined the VC as a dilettante, as a young girl, because her brother, in her dream, the wizard explains the dream, but the Vietnamese deeply believe in dreams, believes was killed in a helicopter thrown out by an American. So she becomes a fighter for the VC, and the government troops, you saw the ambush there, they get her, they nail her. There's always informants, and they torture the bejesus out of her, culminating with throwing snakes down her breasts, as well as the two other girls who were very good. In fact, they both went on very well. They were really good. All the Vietnamese are naturally dramatic, believe me. They have a love of theater. They're good actors, like Chinese, they're not repressed at all. So Lei Lee, this is a hard scene. I'm wondering, wow, this is going to be, tough. She didn't fucking blink. She didn't blink. She was scared, I'm sure, but she took it. That's when I really admired her. I mean, you can say, Oliver wants to throw snakes down her breasts. But how many people did that? That's what the VC did. And she doesn't crack. And of course, she's freed finally because her uncle is a white mouse. He's a cop, and he gets her out. So she goes back to Kila, not having revealed anything with her mother. But the moment she enters Kila, she realizes she's persona non grata because the locals think that she has gotten out of jail because of her pro-government connections. So they go back to the village with the mother, and you can see the looks of the villagers are very, very good. They don't believe for 1 second that she got out of that jail alive because of her innocence. They believe that she was bought off by the parents, who were collaborators with the government, so she was persona non grata. Sure enough, the VC show up and make an example of her, the rape. The boys say, if you mutter a word of this, we'll kill you. This is one of the most ambiguous scenes in the book. In reality, in the re-education camps, they took this girl because she was perceived as a pro-Western type, but we never are sure what the motivation is, and this is in the book itself. They take her out to the jungle to kill her, presumably. They dug her grave. But Lei Lee to this day doesn't understand why. It was something her uncle or her father, mother had done, you see. But she thinks it also could have been a rape job from the beginning. In other words, she was set up as a rape. She was never sure if she was officially condemned to death or if she was just being abused by two of the Viet Cong soldiers. So I'm not saying that Lei Lee is 100% straight storyteller. Who is? I mean, let's be serious. Richard Nixon, Kissinger. I mean, it's very hard to get the straight truth from anybody. But the fact is that she was soiled forever and destroyed that night, and her childhood was over. And the Viet Cong were as much to blame as were the Americans later on, who used her in other ways as a prostitute. So Lei Lee went through a period of low self-esteem, very low. She was a cigarette girl, a prostitute, and like so many of these young girls who did not have an education, came from villages, had to really, luck played a large role in this. She did meet the right guy who, in this case, in reality, he was a guy named Ed, who was a construction supervisor. He was not a soldier. He was an ex-soldier. And a lot of the ex-soldiers went back to Vietnam in their short sleeves with their white shirts, working for the Morrison Knudsen type construction companies and marrying young Oriental brides 30, 40 years younger than they were. And Ed brought her back to the States and I think died of a heart attack within a year or two. And then her second husband died too. Dennis committed suicide. So, Lei Lee was joking around. She says, I'm terrible for men. Don't ever ask me to marry you because you're not going to last long. She's one tough lady. Some people have said the one of the most beautiful shots in the film is the overhead of the chopper with the hat flying away. And I was thinking of Andrew Wyeth, who did that wonderful painting called Christina's World. And, it evokes an emotion that is very similar to Lei Lee's initiation into warfare. Many Vietnamese have very strong feelings of hatred and resentment towards Lei Lee because she, perhaps having lived so intensely, is, like many of us, is just more open to change, and people who are not open to change don't like her. So certainly the hardcore right-wing exile community here in California made her life miserable, still do, as did the Cuban right-wing exile community in Miami, made life miserable for progressive voices. In this scene, they're going to Saigon for the first time, but this was really Bangkok. I put all those movie posters in. I love those movie posters. And here's this girl. She's Joey was her name. Thai girl, one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen at that time. And she sees her first set of high heels, jewelry. She's never dreamed of it. That's my son Sean going there with Dr. Renna, Chris Renna, and two nurses. Renna's a Jesuit, an ex-Jesuit, so that's why I joked around. And that was the last shot of the film, actually. The last day in Bangkok before we went back to the States to do the last section in Southern California. Here they're being checked for lice, and their first big job, after months of looking, they get a big opportunity as servants in a rich French household, French-Vietnamese household. Something out of The Lovers by Jean-Jacques Hano. That's Vivian Wu at her Shanghainese best. With Vivian is also one of the few actresses I could really find of that generation who could speak English and project what I wanted. It was very hard, I can't tell you. A lot of the Vietnamese actresses that I ran across, the professional actresses, had grown up under a system in Vietnam wherein they were trained to be highly formalized, stylized in their delivery of words and movement. So they weren't real to me as movie people. And it was hard to find, as I said, real people who could speak. Now, right here is the husband. This guy is wonderful. I found him in, I believe, San Francisco. He was a painter, had no acting experience, but he had something in his face which I found truly amazing. And I thought that there was a interesting chemistry between the two. He was her first lover and gave her her first child. And this was a common enough practice in high-class Vietnamese households in the sense that the maids were looked on as fair game. Here she has a set of dreams about Ki La. The movie really centers on Ki La. Ki La is the home, it's the heart. And in this black and white sequence, she dreams of the desolation that has occurred. And now the owner of the house, who's a bit of a roue, I met him, by the way, years later. His fortunes had declined during the North Vietnamese takeover, and he was at re-education camp, came back, and he was a very humble and lowly pipe fitter, bicycle builder when I met him. Older man. It was unbelievable to imagine them as a young couple madly in love, but it was great to see their faces when they met. And one of my favorite moments in the movie is at the very end when he comes out and he sees her and she sees him. It's just, you can't do it better than that. It's all about eyes here. It's all about eyes. You see? He doesn't give her any eyes. And she falls for him because I think he's gentle. And it's her first example or treatment by men of being gentle. I mean, here is a woman who had snakes thrown down her breasts, who was tortured by the North Vietnamese, and in the scenes you saw, was shackled together. By the way, that reminded me very much of the Khmer Rouge, when they were all shackled in the same cell. What really most Americans don't know, and what Americans who go back realize, is that the war completely eradicated the infrastructure of the country. The agricultural, it made people dependent. Think about that. It made people dependent on the government. You see, before, Vietnam was a beautiful place, I think, except for the colonialism. But out in the countryside, it was hard for the French colonialists to really penetrate. So the people were really free, with an allegiance to the king or the prime, or whatever, the Buddhism or whatever they chose. But these villages were free. But what happened was that the war killed that off. That's what militarization seems to come to, government control. People were put into hamlets, if you remember, by American policy devised in Washington. Hamlets are the death of democracy, because hamlets force people, for protection purposes, to live outside a normal, between heaven and earth existence, father and mother. It made you into a refugee. And you can't do that with Buddhists. They're removed from their ancient cemeteries where they worshiped their ancestors, which you have to understand is a key element to this universe. I became a Buddhist as a result of this film. I had flirted with it before in the 60s, but not seriously, but it was Lei Lee and a couple of other people who put me over the top, in that I constructed, as a result of a real shrine room in my house where I have pictures of all the important people in my life that I have invested with. And perhaps I should put some enemies in there too, I realize, but I really believe in that concept that you, every day, not just on Sunday, should be in touch with your past, with the people who have given you your chance. And you must not forget that you are as much the product of your grandfather and great-grandfather as you think you are of yourself, you see? Buddhism is a humbling experience. It's more of a philosophy to some than a religion, but to me it's a religion. It's a spiritual thing. It makes me feel right with the world when I can feel right with the world. So meditation becomes for me the highest form of spirituality. Meditation implies oneness, that you are one with God, one with yourself, one with Buddha, one with the universe. And there is no finer feeling. This feeling meditation for me was very difficult at first, because I'm a doer, and many people think of me as a roughneck and running around. But, to sit alone for 30 minutes in front of a Buddha every morning for years is very, very important. Although now, unfortunately, with the amount of technology we have in our Western culture, it's becoming more and more difficult. I always find that technology makes more work. So people are moving faxes and information around the globe so much faster that we have more work to do and with less time to meditate. So we all have that problem. But you cannot separate people from their cemeteries. In the West, we do. We don't even see the dead. When my grandma died in France, my mom was French, they laid out her body on a bed in Paris in 1970s for 5 days. You can't do that in the United States. You cannot have a dead person in your room. So it's very important. You know why? Because you can go talk to your grandmother like Brando did in Last Tango in Paris, and something happens between you and the dead. I was 30 years old. My grandmother was 78, and I cried. And I said, Mom, I have failed. I have not done anything in my life that you ever saw that you could be proud of. It's a very significant moment. And it was only because she wasn't in a goddamn grave where I couldn't see her. I could actually see her alone. And it changed my life at 30 years old. I went out. I never was the same person again. I wrote Platoon within months of that meeting, and I changed my life. So there is something to be said for communicating with the dead and not assuming that they're dead. You must assume that their spirit is alive. Memory is perhaps the greatest god of all. And by memorizing the war, those who were killed, and memorizing those who were close to you, you do them a great service and honor by remembering. But anyway, the point I was trying to make is that these people were separated from their ancestors, and that's the core of Buddhism. So then when that was taken away, as well as the traditional agricultural support system, which is they made the rice grow, the people were never able to get back. Therefore, they were never able to support the regime of Bao Dai, the original emperor that the Americans installed. After him in 1955, we put in Niu Xinjiang, the president, and his evil, corrupt brother-in-law, and the dragon lady, of course, who you some older ones may remember. There were three of them, and they ran the country like a little fiefdom, like Claire Booth Luce and Henry Luce, like Chiang Kai-shek in nationalist China, like Syngman Rhee in Korea, all through Asia after World War II, when we beat the Japanese. We installed, because of MacArthur, the worst elements of the collaborationists with the Japanese, you see. People like Ho Chi Minh, people like Mao, people like freedom fighters, in the Hucks in the Philippines, the guys who really took on the Japanese were completely ignored by our political superstructure, which indicated that they were pro-communist, ergo bad, and we always backed the bad guys in Asia. And this is, of course, what led to Vietnam. Cambodia, the destruction in Cambodia, contrary to what you may be told by your teachers, is truly, truly an American event. We took the war into Cambodia. We dropped 7 times as many bombs in Cambodia as we dropped in the entire World War II. We desiccated it, and there's a great deal of reason why the Cambodian peasants despised Western materialism as a result of that, and ended it. Perhaps I agree, they were too harsh. They killed anybody with glasses or palm prints that didn't show hard work. I mean, they wanted to take. It was called Year Zero. That's what they did. They went back to Year Zero to get rid of materialism. But, we have a lot to do with that. It's not just the Khmer Rouge. It's us. Nixon invaded Cambodia. Look at my film Nixon, and you'll understand perhaps why. It was a political decision. It had nothing to do with the needs of the people. So, ultimately, it was one of the great underlying tragedies of Vietnam that I was never aware of as an infantryman. I was just a soldier, a PFC, then I was a specialist 4th class on the Cambodian border, so, I couldn't see the big picture. I wanted to be a warrior. I wanted to fight. I wanted to say that I'd been there, and I did get there. I did fight, and I didn't understand it until years later. And coming around to heaven and earth was so beautiful for me. It was one of the great experiences of my lifetime, I have to admit to you and say that the 90s were very hard for me in terms of being accepted. I think JFK crossed the Rubicon, and then Heaven and Earth, Natural Born Killers makes, to some people, no sense whatever after Heaven and Earth, but it does make sense to me. And then Nixon, and then the U-turn, and then Any Given Sunday, plus the book I wrote, Charles' Night Dream. I mean, creatively, for me, I couldn't have asked for a better era. But for some reason, the critical perception, including the Doors on my movies, was always negative. You see, so I'm glad I'm alive after 10 years and still making films and still believing, because you need to be an optimist in this business. Otherwise, you can become cynical and bitter and envious, and you can really hurt yourself. So this is a movie, I think, pure example of a movie that I would go back tomorrow and do, knowing that I would only gross $6 million or $12 million, and it just doesn't matter. I could live and die with this movie. I could stand by it. It's clumsy to me in areas because I had to cut 220 to get that extra show, It probably should have been about 240, because Vietnam is a slower pace, and America should have a faster pace. But I didn't want to offend the masters either at Warner Brothers. I wanted to make them believe in the film. It's a great scene when he says goodbye to her. He gets thrown out by the GI. It's all screwed up. She's got a baby by an American now, an American baby by a rape. The father is ashamed. A new American boyfriend who she's dating for money throws the father out. The father is desecrated. His daughter he will not talk to. His life is over. It's so sad. So sad, because the Americans, in a way, don't understand the ancestor worship. They don't understand the family bond. They don't understand the loyalty, the love. So we would go into these villages and we'd break it apart as if they were a different species. The gooks, that John McCain so loves to refer to. Although I remind you that John McCain never fought on the ground. He always fought from the air, except in prison. The Vietnamese, if you're really interested in the subject, I would refer you to Neil Sheehan's book, Bright Shining Lie, which won the Pulitzer Prize. In that book, he details the life story of an American military man. That general dropped his military ranking and became a civilian warlord. He was like the Lawrence of Arabia of America, and he always was against the American military policy in Vietnam. He thought of it as a guerrilla war, and I do too. I mean, in retrospect, I say we should have fought the war from off coast. We should have fought it as guerrillas. We should have fought with elite troops, commandos. We never should have gone in, never built PXs, never built base camps, because they become attractions like Las Vegas for the Viet Cong. At the same time, they also become great funnels of money. The helicopter business down in Texas did another couple of $100 billion. 6,000, 7,000 choppers went down in Vietnam. Each chopper costs X amount of dollars. Fort Worth, General Dynamics, Lyndon Johnson was always a friend of the U.S. military in Texas. Pork barrel Lyndon. I can't tell you how much money was spent by the American military. The war completely eradicated the infrastructure of the country. The agriculture, we used to walk through in the 25th Infantry in Cambodia, in the Hobo Woods, and the border, we used to walk through jelly hanging like parachutes from the rainforest, and it was, Agent Orange. Little did we know at the time that, our sperm cells were being fucked with and our minds were being destroyed by cancer. Many, many young men have suffered from Agent Orange. No one tells you. No one tells you about the friendly fire. How many American boys were killed by other Americans, not by the NBA? 25%. In every firefight that I was in, bullets were winging over my head from guess where? Behind me. The guys were throwing grenades blindly. But I did freeze up myself, It was my first whiff of combat. And I couldn't pull the detonator, the safety on the Claymore mine. And the guy next to me lost an arm, and I was shot in the neck, and I swore I was dying because a friend of mine had been killed 2 weeks before. And he was happy as a lark getting into the helicopter. White sheets, pretty nurses. He looked happy. And then 24 hours later, we heard that he had died of internal injuries, you see. You can never tell. So I got the wound in the neck. And my first impression was that it doesn't feel that bad, but I'm dying. But they didn't pay any attention to me. They just looked at me. They said, just, flesh wound, blah, blah, blah. And the guy next to me had no arm. From Texas, he was a machine gunner. So that was a pretty heavy thing. And then Gardner was killed, my friend from the States, the guy who was fat, who showed me the picture of Raquel Welch. But Gardner was the only guy who came in with me. So, in a sense, it's Manichaean. Yes, I lived, he died. But internal bleeding, it's called. It's a very dangerous thing because you think you're okay, but you're not. You know, at the end of the day, when the government, the Catholic government, appointed by Atchison in '55 by Eisenhower, is a Catholic in an 80% Buddhist country, and he's corrupt and he has no following. It was a tremendous mistake, and I bet you Tom Dooley and the Cardinal from New York, Francis Spellman, was a strong anti-communist. So the priests in Vietnam always used to bless us. It was like I had fun making the football room scene with the priest, you know, praying. The priest is like blessing the team at the end of this loss. Didn't you love that? I went to my play book, the Bible, and the unjust and the just and the fall of the rain on both alike. When Lei Lee crosses the bridge for the first time to be a prostitute, you hear in the background a deep, sonorous Tibetan Buddhist chanting. To the unaware, the sound is just ominous and atmospheric. But the chanting is can be perceived also, as the strain of deathless kind of spirituality underscoring Lei's life. War is never exciting, and it's hard to render. So 15 students being killed on a Paris or Mexican barricade in '68 is nothing. But in world news, it's much more important. Kent State, 4 people had much more impact than 250,000 incapacitated jihadis, 2 to 3 million Vietnamese. So I wanted to go back and really give the Vietnamese their due. Not that I'm an expert, but I took the best people I could. I mean, I couldn't pretend to be that. And I think there's a tremendously awful political correctness that demands right now, this day, that Shakespeare can't write about the Moors, or Stone can't write about Vietnam because he's a white man. Bullshit. If you hang out with Vietnamese, you can get to know. And the girl that the New York Times assigned to write the piece, which destroyed much of the movie, was an urban Vietnamese with no experience whatever of being a peasant, of having her fucking feet stuck in the mud with leeches. I made Joan and go to North Vietnam a week before, 2 weeks before. I was worried about Joan because she was a precious princely from Last Emperor, I said, Joan, I want you to get a goddamn water pail, and I'm going to put the full amount of water in it. I want you to feel the weight of the water on the bamboo. It's not an easy thing. And when you do these menial tasks, you will understand the culture of rice. Rice is a god. It's a god because, as the mother says in the movie, one wasted morsel of rice is an insult. You eat what is given to you. Unfortunately, Hang was killed after the picture in a very strange robbery, but it is my belief, I'm not a conspiracist in this fact, many people believe he was killed by the enemies he'd made in Cambodia. He was a very dedicated man. My real feeling, you know what it is that the gang kids got to him, approached him, because they didn't know he was Hang, or just he was a person on the street. And when they took everything. He didn't mind. But when they tried to take the locket around his chest with a picture of his wife and his daughter, both of whom had perished in the Khmer Rouge War. And I know Hang, he was a stubborn man. He would have died for that. He never would have given up that picture. And I believe that the boys shot him. But is that bad? By our standards, Western standards, yes. He died violently. Is it good? Yes, too. Because like the ancient Greeks taught us, he went out on his shield. He died for what he believed in. How few of us ever do that? How few of us? Hang never chose comfort. The entire time of the film, he was flying back to Cambodia, helping with his charities, making enemies left and right, because Hang, one thing I could say about Hang, he needed a bedside manner. He was a brusque man, and sometimes could be very irritating. But you know what? He was a man of great principle. I don't think that I'd hang out with Hang, at a bar in Buenos Aires, but you know what I'm saying? I admired him. The last scene of Lei pulling away from her father, it's so sad because in a way he's saying like, what will you do without me, little peach blossom? And the real meaning is, what will I do without you? He knows he's dying, and he dies. What was interesting, of course, was Lei was 40-some and Hip was 22, a boat person, very rough trip out of Vietnam. So Lei was teaching her the old Vietnam. And thank God, Hip was a peasant. I said earlier, the New York Times panned the picture with a woman who had never spent one iota of her. She was like the French Revolution, She would have been executed at the border with having cologne on her hands. She never understood. The warfare in the countryside was far more important, ultimately, than the warfare in the city. Tet Offensive is only the result of discontent. You pay taxes to the VC. You pay taxes to the government, supported by us, and their bribes, really. How is a businessman supposed to make a living with double taxation? It's very tough. So we open Act 3 with Saigon, and she's a sophisticated woman driving a motorbike, and she's managing a Korean club. She meets Tommy Lee Jones, who follows her like a lunatic. She's very shy, and he finally kind of weasels his way into her life. And he tells her on his lap, I need a good Oriental woman. And her mother tells her, never go to America. Americans have no past, no future. They're ghosts. They're white, hungry ghosts. So she listens, but she goes to America. And of course, as I said before, everything is turned on its head. War is inextricably tied to fascism, because fascism to me has always meant the marriage of the corporate with the state. And when the corporate is subsidizing the state, and vice versa, and the state is feeding back benefits to the corporations, that's the marriage of fascism. And fascism is very interested in war, historically. Why? Much more so than communism. Fascism put out the story, it seems to me, in the early part of the 20th century when Morgan was in charge, and World War I was still to be fought, but they were floating bombs on the German side, on the British side. There's a whole history of economic imperialism here. Colonies were very, very valuable. At that point, fascism, not communism, engaged war, you see. Fascism in 1914 led to these insane economic treaties and geographic treaties that broke apart the whole world. From 1914 on, the world was never the same. The Victorian era was over. My grandparents in France lived through that period. My grandfather was in World War I. He was a soldier. He got gassed. I saw his feet. He lived to be 81 years old. And he also had gangrene all over his feet. And he'd been mustard gassed in the war. It was just like Kubrick drew it in Paths of Glory, just a miserable war. And to have been stuck there at Passchendaele or Somme would have been just, there was just mud. There was nothing, Fascism, in order to breed more money, must create huge munitions and industry. In Vietnam's case, it was helicopters, it was planes, it was huge bombing racks and planes and guns. Connecticut benefited hugely, as well as Texas, from the sale of M16s at Colt, I believe it was. And I think a third of those M16s didn't work because I can tell you about plenty of a GI in the bush with the mud and the dirt and the piss all over him and trying to load an M16, and it won't work. That's when you really face the end of the barrel, But communism never came along until 1917, you see. And it was the result of World War I. It wasn't the instigator. It was fascism that was the instigator of World War I. Because industry needs war. Or, as I said in JFK, the organizing principle of society is the ability of a nation state to make war. At least it has been up to now. We'll soon see what happens. But fascism needs war. Communism was a reaction to it. It was called for, as you remember, the international, the coming together of all peoples, which was a wonderful idea. It works on paper, but it doesn't kind of work because the world is fractured and fragmented, as are my films. But at the same time, communism was never to blame. It was the boogeyman. We haunted it from the Palmer's raids in 1917 through Hoover and through the early, anti-Bolshevik efforts, and then up to McCarthy and Nixon, Eisenhower, and the madness of the 60s, and then the Reaganism of the 80s, and the destruction, finally, of the Cold War empire in 1989, or whatever it was. So it goes from in 1917 and 1989, the heart of our century is communist fear. The greatest conspiracy of all, by the way. It has nothing to do with reality. Because when I grew up as a kid in the 50s in New York City, my father scared the bejesus out of me, saying things like, "I'm really worried, Oliver." What? We're just not putting enough money into weapons. We're not ready for the Russians. They're smarter than we are. They work for the state. They're subsidized. They're efficient. They're economic. They're scientific. I was really scared. And, we lived in fear that the H-bomb was going to hit New York City. So in school we'd have drills and dive under desks or go down to the basement with Mrs. Prothrow, our art teacher, sit there for an hour and fear. These are kids you're drilling fear into. So Nixon is the greatest conspiracist of all, although I get that rap. Nixon is the greatest story maker of all time because he went to Eisenhower and said, Castro's a communist, blah, blah, blah. There was this monolithic communist conspiracy that my father talked about, from China to Russia to Hungary to East Germany. They were all united. We were not. We were all... Charles de Gaulle was dividing the alliance, if you remember, in 1958. The American dollar was devaluating quickly because through the Marshall Plan, Europe and Asia had gotten back on their feet. So there was a lot of tension in 58, a lot of tension. That's why I believe Eisenhower made that extraordinary farewell address speech in which he said, "Beware the military-industrial complex." You're one of the most conservative generals of our history, a real organization man, a corporation man, and a golfer, apparently, as well as a destabilizer of some 20 countries while he's playing golf. It was very well done. It's called a black op. Eisenhower got away with murder and left poor John Kennedy with, a bag full of tricks. So Kennedy was stunned, and he got more than he expected. He fired Dulles, and he fired Cabell, and he fired Bissell, the three key guys. But those guys, believe me, had a lot of friends in the CIA, going down to David Atlee Phillips, Clay Shaw, and about 20, 30 others that were just loyalists, guys like G. Gordon Liddy years later, guys who believed in loyalty at any cost. And Ed Lansdale, Major Ed Lansdale, don't forget him, although he wasn't in the CIA. He was this weird amalgam. But these characters did exist, and there was hatred. There was genuine hatred in those days. And I really do believe in my heart and in my mind that is the inner soul of the conspiracy. It was that well done. It was not outside the ordinary. As Fletcher Prouty once said to me in Maryland, it was normal. It was the way things were done. Most of it we got away with. So we see stupid pictures today who have no historical context. One of our greatest filmmakers, Marty Scorsese, made a film about Tibet called Kundum. In that film, he never once mentioned the presence of the American CIA, to the best of my knowledge, in that country, which was so active in the 50s that even in Tibet we're rumoring that the Dalai Lama was on our payroll, you see. And Fletcher confirmed to me that he trained Gurkhas and all kinds of people to go into Tibet and to provocate China. When China came across and conquered Tibet, it was not a one-sided affair at all. It was very ambivalent. It was very much like Iran and Afghanistan years later. America was very present against China. We circled it from the south with the Kuomintang, and then we circled it from Taiwan, and we circled it from Japan. So we always had a policy. And Nixon, as you know, tried very hard and succeeded briefly for 30 years in dividing Russia and China. In the scene I tried to show on the boat in the Potomac, where his plan was continue the Vietnam War. Why? Not about the loss of lives. It was about triangulating. It was about getting Vietnam here, Russia there, China there, in a triangle, at odds. And he succeeded. Because the Russians and the Chinese, he knew from information, secret information, had not been on good terms since Mao went to Moscow to visit Stalin. The first time, right after the revolution in 1949. Stalin treated him like a dog. He put him away in a guest house and didn't even come and see him for a few days. It was like he was treated like a second-class citizen. This is China. Mao never forgot the loss of face, ever. And Stalin, again, tricked him a second time in Korea. Read, for that matter, a conservative book by Harrison Salisbury, New York Times, called The Two Emperors, in which he describes in detail the betrayal by Stalin of Mao in Korea. So it ended up that Stalin would not go to nuclear war with the United States, with the crazy MacArthur, etc., but that he would back down. Mao said, fuck that, and threw a million troops across the Yalu. He put his money where his mouth was. So Mao really took on the Russian state. So there was no conspiracy between Russia and China. None at all. Nixon was wrong. McCarthy was wrong. They were all wrong. Meanwhile, we built up a huge, huge, huge military empire. Of course, motivated by the English, Winston Churchill and his brethren had taught us the art of war. We had no intelligence of any significance before World War II. We learned all our stuff from the Germans and from the English. We also protected the Germans in vast quantities, as you know. Among those protectors, by the way, was Clay Shaw. He ran a program called, I believe, Operation Pinpoint or something of that nature, in which part of the deal was to bring out as many of Galen's guys, experts in intelligence behind Bolshevik lines, to the United States. He also helped bring over scientists like Von Braun, who taught us how to fire missiles out of Alabama and Arkansas. So, to the victor, the spoils, right? But there's a great chapter in a book that I advise any student to read, any student. It will take only 1 hour of your time, and you will learn more from that than in 1 year of college. Pick up Buckminster Fuller's book from about 1982. I don't remember the title, except for the chapter. The chapter is called Liggly Piggly. It is a weird name for a chapter, in which he steps out of his scientific mode and he gives you the history of global capitalism from Phoenician times to now. It is eye-opening. And he talks about where the money goes, overseas and unseen. And he talks about banks, he talks about where it's all at, and it's easy to understand as a layman. You don't have to go to Harvard Graduate School to pick this up. Fuller was a genius in his ability, like McLuhan, to express what was on his mind. I do believe that Eisenhower in '58 began to see the power of what was going on. This was pointed out by another person to me, Christopher Shallett, that there was a internecine warfare in the American power class between the concept of insurgency, which had worked so well under Lansdale and Dulles in the 50s. We destabilized anywhere from 15 to 20 governments we don't even know. We also, broke the Bolsheviks in Italy or the socialists, and we broke them in France with the strikes. And we rebuilt the world under the Bretton Woods Agreement. But then Bretton Woods, when Nixon came in, it's ironic that was the end of it. The American dollar had eroded. It had started to erode in the late 50s because we had started to put so much money into our military, which is fascism. The military was now a partner of the state. So America was slowly going downhill, and the foreign countries we had raised were going uphill. So it was a real interesting time, and there was a tremendous tension between defense and state. Dean Rusk was worthless in the sense that I don't think he ever accomplished anything. He never did anything. He just went along. He was a Secretary of State. It was a disappointment when Kennedy appointed him because I think we all expected an Atchison or a distinguished man from the past to assume that role. Dean Rusk was very disappointing, whereas McNamara was who he was. He was a genius. I met him. It's another story. It's another story. He's a very tragic figure. So what I'm saying is that I think Kennedy fell between two pressures that would not be outside the realm of possibility now or before. He essentially was a believer in the counterinsurgency concept, which was lower key and less expensive. And there was now a push. Curtis LeMay was over at the Air Force and saying, let's bomb Hanoi back to the Stone Age. And Wheeler and Harkins and Westmoreland, these were all they were pushers. And these guys wanted war. They wanted to beef up the military. And so they went for the big bucks. And they didn't, counterinsurgency warfare to them was peanuts, and it pissed them off. It was CIA warfare. So they wanted big bucks, and that's when the two factions were. I mean, talk to Fletcher Prouty about General Dynamics in Texas. You'll understand. Bell Helicopter. 5,000 choppers were shot down in Vietnam. Each chopper cost $20 million. I don't know what it was. I mean, it was a fortune. A fortune in helicopters was paid. Kennedy fell between because Kennedy, being a pragmatist, wanted to keep the money low and would never have committed to Vietnam the way Johnson did. Steve, who knows Vietnam is falling apart, tries to get her out, but he's got his own duties. But he gives her a special pass to go to the American consulate in Saigon. She finally gets there after much turmoil. And there's 10,000 people at the gate, and she can't get in. And in fact, we shot it on Sunday morning in Bangkok, and it was so noisy and crowded that the AP wires reported there was another coup d'etat in Bangkok. For about 24 hours, that story existed. The 60s were booming, as you know, but we had inflation, as opposed to the 90s. And when Tommy Lee Jones returns to America, in this funny scene, he drives this little Volvo, his mom's Volvo, to the... he's living with his mother. Here's a full-grown man living with his mother, Debbie Reynolds. It's a very funny scene when they meet. They come to America. She's overwhelmed by the materialism. The daughter, the fat daughter, Conchata Farrell, and the perky but shallow mother, Debbie Reynolds. Laylee's eyes are just open to American wise. There was one scene, they were all looking one Sunday afternoon at the story on the news, because by this point the news had become for profit, you understand. They were looking at the story of a baby that fell down a well in West Virginia for 20-some days. That was the greatest story in the world. Meanwhile, thousands of people were dying in Vietnam. So I had Laylee looking around the room like I had Cameron looking around the room at the football box, when she realizes all they care about is materialism. Laylee cries because a baby in a well, it's sad. But it's soap operatic, you see. Laylee's first book ended, in a sense, with Rhett Butler, Tommy Lee Jones taking her off to the West, but it didn't really get into the problems of the West, right? It seemed like that would be the movie ending, right? She goes west, all her problems are solved in the U.S. Well, the whole point of the movie was they were not solved in the U.S. And what emerged from this tremendously exciting experience was that I wrote the screenplay with Vietnam, U.S., Vietnam, U.S., Vietnam. So I had 2 visits to the U.S. before, whereas the movie that you now see is all linear. It's an interesting combination of factors that moved me in that direction, including the fact that by going to the U.S. early and showing her as a developed, saved person, you lost the tension of what would happen to Laylee, you see. So I sacrificed that aspect of it to go with a more traditional, linear, classic story of a young woman like Carrie. Yeah, Carrie comes to mind, Theodore Dreiser, the woman who comes to from a small town or comes to the big city, That was what I wanted to do. The closure to the whole deal for me came when I was on a flight from Hanoi back to Ho Chi Minh City with Lei Lee, and she was writing on something, and I said, "What are you writing?" She said, "I'm writing part 2 of my memoirs." I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Well, here it is. It's called Child of War, Woman of Peace." And it was not as good as the first book. It didn't have the simplicity of it because she was writing it with another co-writer who wasn't as talented, in my opinion. However, it had a very key element that was missing in the first book. It had closure. It had a concept, a theme, in which I finally began to understand the nature of her American experience, how it affected her, and what happened to her when she came back. I think that Buddhism is really, if you are a thinking man and a feeling man, I think that there is no greater answer to the madness of life than Buddhism. Just with a guru from the Ningpa school, which is perhaps the most outrageous outlaw school. They drink, they have women, they carry on, and they make no bones about it, thank God. But the harder-edged Buddhist, the other tribes of Buddhism have always resented the Ningpas and killed them, in fact. But these are guys that are up in the mountains. They were fighters, they were warriors. Trungpa here in the United States was a great proponent of Ningpa. He wrote a wonderful book, if you ever can buy one, called Crazy Wisdom. Read that. He also wrote several other books out of Colorado and Boulder. But, he was a controversial figure. You'll see at the end of the movie what she says. It's really beautiful. It's truly one of the most beautiful passages I've ever read. He wrote in combination with Lei Lee. You get the picture that America is suffering economically. There's no jobs for people like him. And there were no jobs for Vietnam veterans. You had to really start over. Very, very tough time.
You want them, you get out!
And my point of view is that she's the immigrant. And the immigrant will always do better. Taking together all these, let's say, 5 to 6 major American husbands and boyfriends, I made Tommy Lee Jones, who is a fascinating character to me in that in Vietnam, he's John Wayne. He saves her life. He's the guy like Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. He's the great big American. The guy against whose bosom you feel safe. And then he goes back to America, and you see, from Lei Lee's point of view, it's all subjective. You'll begin to understand the way she sees Americans, right down from the lack of harmony between family members and the sense of not immediately being grateful, and the lack of gratitude and overfedness, the icebox, being overfed, oversatiated, over-materialized, and the simplicity is gone, you see. And that was so clear, and that was the beginning, of course, of the destruction of Tommy Lee Jones, which follows.
I can't live without you.
You see the John Wayne living on dreams of a payday, of being a soldier, an ex-soldier who could become involved in the arms trade with the big shots and make millions of dollars. But his dreams don't pan out, and he feels himself a whole failure and becomes angrier and angrier with Lei Lee because Lei Lee won't become Christian, which is what it is. It's just a disguise, really, for a deeper problem, is that Lei Lee is really adapting to the United States. She's smart, like many of the Orientals and Vietnamese are very smart. She learns the trade. She goes to work in a factory. She does well, and she becomes smarter and smarter, better and better. He becomes more disillusioned, and then I think it's one of the most intense scenes I've ever filmed was the time when Tommy Lee, who's 6 feet tall, pulls a shotgun on Hip T. Lee and tries to scare her, blow her brains out. Typical domestic violence situation with a Vietnam veteran or a football player. You hear about it all the time, but she diffuses the situation, turns the gun, around, and he puts it to his mouth and trying to kill himself. She prevents him. And I think some of the best lines of dialogue in the film are right then and there when she says, different skin, same suffering. I find that always kind of squeezes my heart. It feels hard. Different skin, same suffering. And she tells him that in reincarnation, she explains the Buddhist way, that she had many past lives, and one of them was a soldier. That's what brings her and Tommy Lee Jones together, as they're both soldiers, and they are. They're warriors, child for peace. Child of war, woman of peace. Child of war, woman of peace. Interesting title. In any case, Tommy Lee Jones is not able to make the transition, but he knows he should. He commits horrible suicide. It's like some of the most tender stuff. I cry when I see this movie. I am a sap. I'm a male, weepy, sentimental. I can see where the feminists would get on my case. But, I think that people really respond to the heart like a Ghost. Ghost is a great example of a movie that may not have met the criterion of all the snooty critics, but at the end of the day, it was real. It was unreal real. It hit a chord, as did Sixth Sense. So, what I'm saying? There is something to be said for the popular as opposed to the elite who resent the popular. The more money a movie makes, the more distanced you become.
Not now. Can't you? Please. Let him go.
The biggest break is when it's her first step in identifying her enemies. She says, she gets on the phone, she says, please, I will do it. I will go back to your church. I will study Christianity. I will be what you want me to be. And in those words, he realizes deeply the horror to which he has crossed. In the latter part of the film in America, you see sections where I didn't go as far as I should have because I was frankly a little worried about the Christian church here and the Baptists and all that. If I'd known the picture would have made only $6 million, I might have even gotten more radical. But the point was that Jeffrey Jones, who I love from Amadeus, played the Christian minister of Debbie Reynolds. So at one point when things get impossible, they say, okay, why don't you go see the Reverend? So she goes to the Reverend, and it's a wonderful scene. It's not in the movie. And she sits there in the church, and she says, there's one thing I don't understand, Father. What is that, darling? My dear. And then we have the camera pans all the Christian iconography, including Christ being crucified. And all you see are pain, tears, stained windows of glass and suffering. And Leili says in her innocent little way, I don't understand Christianity. Everyone is suffering, everyone is dying, everyone is being tortured. In Buddhism, we know suffering is the first law of life. But as a result, most of our iconography is of people that are happy. There is no original sin in Buddhism. You are born into the world with a karma. But every baby can have joy. Karma is your determinant. But not everybody is born with original sin, you see. Karma is, if let's say you are born with bad karma, that is original sin, I suppose, by Christian standards. What if you're born with good karma? Why should you inherit original sin? It makes no sense to me. And nor did it to Leili. And she was very eloquent in stating this argument. And because she's 4'11" and Jeffrey Jones is 6'4", it's a hilarious scene because Jeffrey kind of dismisses her thinking as he poo-poos it. And he tells her to come to Christian class more often, So we have this enormous, interesting cultural context of Asian people being, the missionaries are at work in Asia still, and they come here and they're asked to become Christian. But Leili, in her innocence, asks the fundamental questions. And she has it's also cut, she has a fight with Debbie Reynolds and Conchata Farrell about Christ, you see. It's a very significant fight. I cut it out again for fear that I would offend the American Christians. I didn't intend to, because there's a lot in Christianity that's good, and a lot of Christianity is based on Buddhism and vice versa. Although I think Buddhism came first. So it's her very act of love and forgiveness that sets him off. and ends up with his suicide naked in the van. Why naked? Entering the world naked, closing the world naked. Buddhist concept too. So Steve, in a weird way, is playing with the concept of Buddhism. He wants to be a Buddhist, but he can't quite get there because he's motivated by greed and money and worry and anxiety and the usual Western angst. So in the next scene, after he's killed himself, which is beautifully shot, I think, the wizard shows up again, a second wizard. Now this movie is bookended by two wizards. The first wizard kicks off the karma cycle by essentially saying, one brother is well, the other brother, I see a dark cloud. So the wizard is in Vietnam, being very superstitious, believe me, very superstitious. Wizards have great, like Buddhists have great merit. Michael Lee played the role, 95 years old or something. Michael is a wonderful, wonderful character actor out of New York, tough, Chinatown. And if you look closely, he's hilarious. He's got one bad eye. One of the great character actors. I'd love to work with him again. One of the great scenes in the movie, unfortunately, I'm not sure it's clear enough. It was cut so fast, but the wizard does come to visit her afterward to tell her that Tommy Lee Jones is still knocking around the spiritual walls of the temple, and that he wants to get into the temple. He wants to be a Buddhist.
Temple. He said, "Bless me in the temple."
The Vietnamese who believe in astrology and spiritual life and otherworldly life accept this as normal, much more so than we do. And she's happy, and she keeps a little shrine for her husband. But in a scene I cut, Debbie Reynolds and Conchetta Farrell come in, and of course they disapprove of the whole thing, pictures of their son. You see, when you die in America, you're supposed to be buried, and you're not supposed to have any pictures except one. But all these shrines and incense, it's all too much for them. And I cut the scene, but they chide her for being nuts, you know. And at this point, Lei Lee realizes that her American existence in this town is over. She takes her 3 children back to Vietnam, hoping that by meeting their mother and by her brother, they will get a sense of their Vietnamese roots, but they don't seem to really get it, which is sad and true for many people. And she ends up a woman of two worlds, straddling both, as described in the end voiceover, which is, again, I think one of the most sad things I've written, but I think it's really true to the book. And leaves us in a state of understanding that perhaps all of us here in the modern era, as Salman Rushdie said, are products of two cultures, and we end up piecemeal. We end up a patch job. This book is filled with heart. In the picture, I'm asking the American audience to take a proverbial walk in another person's moccasins, to feel the tragedy of being wrenched from a seminal relationship with the land and thrust into an uncertain future. Perhaps in this film, because you don't know your films until you're an old man, you look back, I don't know, you make them, and you try your best, but perhaps people have told me, as tough as I am, and leathery and all that, it's perhaps closer to the heart than any other film that I've made. Lei Lee goes back to Vietnam with her 3 children, and she introduces the first child, Jimmy, to the little aristocrat who she had met, who had now fallen on hard times because of the government and was a simple worker. And to me, it's so sad when they see each other, because no words are really needed. They just understand. And the boy embracing his father for the first time. Rice is a cycle in Vietnam. They plant it maybe twice a year. They get 2 harvests if they can. But it's done by the same methods. As shown in the film, the buckets of water, the women singing. That was Lei Lee. It wasn't me. That was real. Okay, movies can never be real, but it was real. We had 38 Vietnamese or 40 Vietnamese down from northern Thailand. We tried to create a village. It was their village. She goes to the village, to see her mom, who's now aged. Joan Chen, and a great makeup job by Gordon Smith and John Blake. Her mother cries. It's a beautiful scene. And tells her, I was wrong. I pushed your brother to war. I pushed you to stay in Vietnam, and you would not have been as well off as you are now. I pushed and I pushed my point of view on this stuff. But now I understand what life is really about.
How is your sister, Kim?
And it's about the love in your heart. And it takes a long time to see the simple things. Kila, Massapequa, Whittier, California. These are three very idyllic expressions of childhood. Perhaps critics can say Oliver went overboard, Be that as it may, innocence is innocence. You must see innocence from the viewpoint of a 7-year-old, 4-year-old child. You see, I have 3 children, one's 4. I can't tell you the joy I take in watching her mischievous interest in all these new things. I love the way children take for granted what's given to them and grow and grow and grow. Then there's an incredible speech by an amateur actor from Houston or Virginia, a Vietnamese actor called Vinh Dang. Just makes me cry too, because his voice cracks. He really felt it. That was his story. He waited in Thailand for 8 weeks to do that monologue. He was ready. It's been so many years, Bai Li. That's her nickname, Bai Li. Much is forgiven, but you have no idea of the suffering the Americans have caused here. We had to use our own excrement to grow vegetables. All we had to hold on to was the future. And because we knew that that future would not arrive unless we won, we kept dying no matter what. Just like ants beneath the elephant's feet. It wasn't because we were brave, but because we had no choice. And when the future finally came, it was more war. The Cambodians, the Chinese. You have no idea how much your mother suffered. She was too old to work the land, and the paddies, and she had to give the land, our land, to the state after liberation. And now you come here, a rich, strange foreigner, and you will turn the village once more against us, the Fungs, who have suffered so much. Lei Li, in typical fashion, was suckered into the opposing forces. She tried to stay out of the battle, but the essential problem was that the Americans decided to demilitarize. They wanted to put that village in a hamlet. That's what militarization seems to come to, government control. That's fascism, not communism. So there was a division. People were put into hamlets and removed from their ancient cemeteries where they worshipped, which is a key element of the universe. When that was taken, as well as the traditional agricultural support system, the people were never able to get it back. That was one of the great underlying tragedies of Vietnam that I was never aware of as an infantryman. Mother-daughter sit down for the first time in many years and they talk eye to eye, heart to heart. Heaven and earth finally come together. There is no separation between character and audience, no distancing voiceover. I don't think I've ever been more emotionally direct. I'm so proud of you, Bai Li, says mother to daughter. You've seen the side of things that's hidden from most people. They begin to cry. Tears are God's way of paying you back for what he's taken. I have no more tears. I have cried them out to all directions of the winds. You have come back, Bai Li, and that's what matters. You have completed your circle of growth. Low tide to high tide, poor to rich, sad to happy, beggar to a fine lady. Your past is now complete, and my destiny as your mother is now over. I am now looking forward to joining your papa. The question ultimately for me, though, is that Layli has the ability to forgive her enemies, you say. That is a very rare message, and it's not in any other films I've done, although they had, for the most part, the films had positive, upbeat endings. Charlie Sheen in Wall Street, Morrison in The Doors leaves a legacy of great work. JFK, it's a message of hope, ultimately, for a citizenry that is conscious. Here we have a picture wherein you actively have no desire for revenge, that you are, the secret is to compete with yourself, and the secret is to grow in your own intelligence, your mind, your heart, your compassion, so that you are able to forgive all and everyone, even those who hurt you. And she says, in fact, at the end, I thank my enemies for having taught me, which is a beautiful concept, a statement. We all, at least some of us, try to live up to that. It's hard, but it's something worthwhile. And that's why I love this movie so much, because it really tried to be a good movie. And unfortunately, it never got seen by enough people, but it really was seen by people who appreciated it, I think. Layli then sleeps finally in the house that her father wanted her to sleep in. And it's a beautiful scene. And we see the ghost of her father briefly come and kiss her on the lips. It's a beautiful closure for me. Past and present become one. And it's in a form of reconciliation. The woman of peace and the child of war are one. She's a little child. The father is a ghost who kisses her. It's a sad moment. And then we close the film with Layli praying at the village temple like she did when she was a little girl, but she didn't know what to say. Now she knows what to say. And Buddha, which we photographed 3 or 4 times in the movie, is a timeless presence of understanding and mercy. No. And she walks across the field from the Buddha bell, which is still there. And she tells in voiceover like Batum her true feelings about where she stands. Mainly that her karma is both in 2 camps. It's American and Vietnamese now. Her children are halves. So she has straddled America and Vietnam. She calls it the East-West Foundation, and she works very hard at it. But it's a frustrating thing. I built with her Kila's birthing clinic. It's a very bare bones thing, but 800 and some babies have been delivered there. Whereas before, many of the Vietnamese women had to go all the way to Da Lat. So we saved perhaps several lives. And it's still going. It's called the Mother Love Clinic. That's it, in Kila. So Layli and I built that. I'm very un-Hollywood. People don't recognize that, but I just don't have many friends in Hollywood. I don't have many friends because, I'm working all the time, but I enjoy people. I have friends, but Hollywood friends are not friends. They're just, most of them, it's business. Things go well, you're a friend. Things go bad, you don't hear from them. So my life has been like Ulysses, one battered island after the other, following the Circe call. You see, my problem is I always took the earplugs out of my ears so I could hear Circe. And as a result, I don't have the stern discipline of Ulysses. But maybe one day, you never know. I have a feeling in me, immodest as it sounds, that I have 2, maybe 3 great films to do. I just feel that I have the energy to do it. And they will be as tough as they come, and I'll have to fight, to keep my health and all that. The money, distribution, this whole thing about marketing now is killing all of us. You write it, co-write it, you direct it, you produce it, you edit it, and I'm the supervising editor every day. It's your life. The director is perhaps the lowest paid animal on the hierarchy. In Hollywood, you work 2 years, you work 18-hour days, and per hour you probably achieve what chief grip does, Actors get paid the best. The actor system is dead. I hope it's dead. I hope it fucking dies. I don't understand why an actor can make $20 million a picture, which is half the fucking below the line. Half. $20 million. I mean, that is a lot of loot you can put on the screen. You can stage balls in Versailles. You can do Bravehearts. But you got to pay $20 million to a mug. And then on top of it, the greed factor is so ugly that they get $20 million and they ask, they send over through their lawyers 7-10 pages of perks. And the perks come to like $1 million or $2 million extra dollars, like trailers for their chefs and their exercise workouts. And they have so many assistants, It's like in England when you work with an actor, he comes right at you. He's privileged. It's a privilege to work. In America, it's a deal. How much? Blah, blah, blah. It's all assistance. Yes, men. I pick up my own phone at home. My point is that if you're going to take $20 million for your success, then when you're a failure, which all stars have had. All. But if they're going to take 20 to win, you got to take 2 to lose. You know what I'm saying? That's the only, if you're going to play, you can't play a stacked deck. You got to do the both ways. And I've done that all my life. I mean, I've been known to, unfortunately, have my, quote, back end invaded all the time. I produced 12 movies that you don't even know about. None of them made money. Although Joy Luck Club, Reversal of Fortune, and Larry Flint were very talked about, but they were not successful financially. But, people don't understand that the director makes the movie, and he takes the fall, because the actor's moved on. He's done 3 or 4 other movies, whatever. You see, what happened when I came up in this business, I was a screenwriter, but I always wanted to be a director because of film school. And when I took a screenplay, I went into the research. I did 7, 8, 10 months a year. Now, because I deal with a lot of writers and co-writers, I hire them. They're young kids, and they're very elated. The moment they get a deal with me or Steve Spielberg or whatever, they turn around with their agents and they make 4 other fucking deals right on the top of it. I mean, and they give you a week here, a week there. They don't get it. How do you write 4 things at one time? Okay, maybe we're in the digital age, but where's the passion? Where's the depth? I've been nailed a few times. I mean, I'm a cleaner-upper. I'm like the Harvey Keitel in Reservoir Dogs, the liquidator. I come in and I liquidate the script at the end.